Now, let's go to backyard safety, or may not be backyard, but swimming pools. There's been some big changes. Talk to me about them.
Right, swimming pool legislation. In 1993, there were some fairly significant changes which brought in the requirement to have restricted access to a swimming pool area from a house and externally from a property. There is a distinction now between pools built before 1 July 1993 and those that have been built after 1 July 93.
93?
1993, being a critical date. Now,
Okay.
I call this creeping legislation. The government is creeping towards compulsory pool fencing,
Yeah.
but they haven't gone to that first stage. Well, they've gone to the first stage, but haven't gone to the second stage of making it compulsory to have a pool fence after 1993. So you've got two issues with pools. You need to consider when was the pool built and how does the legislation then apply to your swimming pool.
Half the time you'd never know. If it's second or third owner,
Certainly.
there's no way of knowing that.
And councils have merged in the last 15 years and records have been misplaced and lost.
Right, so let's assuming you do know that date. What is the difference between pre-93 and post?
Okay, pre-1993, on the sale of a property, and the critical date is the transfer of the property or settlement.
Not the contract date.
Not the contract date, the date of settlement.
Okay.
So at the date of settlement, the pool must be compliant with the relative legislation. So taking a pre-1993 swimming pool, you must have an external fence, if that's the pool fence, 1.8 metres high. If it's an internal fence, it must be 1.2 metres high as a minimum. And
it's got requirements in terms of how the fence is set up as well.
Yes, you can't have footholds or handholds that a child could climb up. Right. So you couldn't have lateral fencing. It must be vertical, and you can't have a chair leaning against it. You can't have ladders against it. You can't have trees that they could climb up. So it really must have a restriction from outside the pool area to get within the pool area.
Right. So you're just saying, so 1.8 on the boundary?
Boundary, yes.
Right. And internal 1.2?
Yes.
What about brush fencing?
Brush fencing wouldn't comply because children could climb up a brush fence. It's got wires in it. So it must be a compliant pool fence.
And what about post-93?
Post-93, on pre-93 there is one exception, which is complicated again, what should have been a simple process. If you have a swimming pool that is within 1.8 metres of a door,
so 6 feet, yeah?
6 feet of a door, it's deemed to be impractical to put a fence, and so you are allowed to have child-resistant doors.
Which is self-closing, 1.5 metre high
handles.
Handles.
Yep. And the door must open away from the pool area or towards the house.
So if you're inside, you've got to pull it back towards you?
That's right, yep.
Right, okay. And is that all pre-93?
Pre-93.
Now, what's the difference with post-93?
Okay, post-93 hasn't changed from what we've had since 1993.
Which is?
Which is, you can have the same as a pre-1993, so you can have an external fence 1.8 metres, internal fence 1.2 metres, or you can elect to have child-resistant doors. Irrespective of where the pool is from the house, you can have doors that open in, have self-closers and have 1.5 metre high handles, or you can have windows that are restricted in access as well.
That makes absolutely no sense to me.
It's as though a child looks at the date of the pool and says, I won't drown in that pool because it's post-1993.
But that's ridiculous.
It is, yeah. That's why I call it the creeping legislation. We're creeping towards it, but the government, for whatever reason, don't want to make it compulsory to comply with the pre-1993.
Chris, there's got to be somebody in government that's got some logic. What was their logic?
I haven't been able to ascertain the logic.
It's just nuts.
Other than it seems as though they don't want to put an imposition on people who have a pool approved with current legislation, and the 1993 legislation is still current. So they're saying, okay, you had a pool built in, say, 1995, that pool
you adhere to that.
Complies, and it still complies, and therefore we're not going to make you upgrade it because there would be a cost factor potentially. Now, when we're talking children risk and swimming pools, I would have thought the cost is an irrelevant issue. Okay. And it just means that in the future we may have some further changes. And I would expect it would make it, again, compulsory to have a pool fence. Right, but so they didn't just bite the bullet and do it.
So in one sentence, the difference between pre-93 and post is the distance of the pool to the house or to the property, to the door. And if it's greater than 1.8 metres, you have to put a fence in.
Must have a pool fence. Compulsory
Pre-93.
pool fence. Correct.
Okay. Now, spas.
Spa bath. Yes.
Spas, fish ponds, little winky-dink swimming pools, you know, like little portable ones. What's the deal?
Any swimming pool greater than 300 millimetres in depth.
So not necessarily swimming pool, any body of water?
Any water. So a fish pond, if it's more than 1 metre in depth.
A metre?
Sorry, yeah, 300 mils, 1 foot.
Right, so
yep,
300,
a foot deep.
Okay.
Must be complied with swimming pool, you know, with the same fencing issues, the same restriction from the house.
So that would be, there was an article in the paper about like a kiddie's pool, is if it's more than 300 deep, then and it's got a filter on it or something?
If it's, yeah, I'm trying to get my head around how a portable pool actually does work. Because a portable pool, firstly, you can get rid of the 1.8 metre issue because you can take it away from the house, being portable. Yep. But if it's an above ground swimming pool, it uses the same legislation as an in-ground swimming pool. So you can't, if it's got a filter, it's above ground, then you still have to have it fenced.
So if you had an above ground pool that had its sides 1.2 metres high and no way to crawl up it, they wouldn't need a fence?
They wouldn't need a fence. However, the ladder to get into that pool requires the fence. So just because the ladder can be removed doesn't make it compliant, because that ladder could be left on the property and it becomes a child safety issue. So you don't need a pool fence if it's, you know, straight-sided, but you do need one around where the ladder goes.
Right. Okay.
So you can't really avoid a fence somewhere in most instances.
So you see hundreds of spa baths, hundreds of, like they're everywhere. They're all more than 300 deep.
Yes.
And they've got ladders up them. So what you're saying is they need a full pool fence.
They still need a fence, which aesthetically is a difficult thing to do to make it look good.
Well, I suppose the glass ones they're using now look okay, but they cost an absolute fortune.
Yep. And part of the problem we're getting is the vendor's obligation to make a pool compliant by settlement, and what they're prepared to do versus what a purchaser is prepared to accept.
Right. Okay. Let's drill down into that, because that's the important one. Firstly, if you're a landlord, is there any requirement to upgrade your pool?
No.
For your tenant?
Not until you sell that pool.
So it's based on the sale?
It's on the sale. It's what they call the prescribed time. So under the legislation, the prescribed time is the time of a transfer of the property, whether that be to a third party purchaser or maybe even an internal transfer. If you're transferring a property, you know, within your family group, it's still a transfer. Right.
So, but the pool legislation, like there's a lot of pools that might just have a gate from the street. So providing they were compliant at the time of the legislation, which is pre-93, post-93, providing they comply, that's fine unless you go to sell it.
That's right. So you're not required to upgrade until you attend to the sale of the property.
Right. Now, let's be very clear about this. So the person selling the property, not the person buying it, is the one that must comply prior to the transfer to the next person.
Correct, yes. Right. So if the property at the time of settlement is not compliant, the vendor is in breach of the legislation.
And what's the consequence?
It's what they call a Division 4 fine under the Development Act. It's 4 years imprisonment or $15,000 maximum.
So they're serious?
It's a serious fine.
Right.
Yeah.
So if someone presumably died in the pool and they weren't compliant, there'd be some very heavy, wouldn't it?
Potential issues. I mean, there'll be a lot of contributing factors as to how and when and how it occurred. However, you know, you'd probably need to get an insurance lawyer to give a distinct answer as to who's liable, but would you want that hanging over your head?
Right.
And presumably, because the fines are fairly significant in an imprisonment term, if there was a death, you may not want it to come back and visit you.
Now, Chris, we've had a lot of experience in this space because we've sold a lot of properties with pools. So, but I want to ask you the official answer. So, a seller would not be advisable, or let me ask the question. How would you go about it as a seller where you want to make sure you're compliant and you just wash your hands of it and make sure it all happens? How would you go about it?
I'd have the same dilemma that most vendors have. I want to present the property aesthetically pleasing to purchasers. Mm-hmm. Now, if the pool is situated where a pool fence would look ungainly, then perhaps I want to market it with the intention of making it compliant for settlement.